Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to have Professor Richard Landis as welcome guest today. Let me briefly introduce him. Professor Landis is an American historian of apocalyptic movements, trained as a medievalist at Princeton University. Until 2015, he taught at Boston University and then began working at Bar-Ilan University. He lives currently with his life in Jerusalem, where he, quote unquote, he can write free of politically correct pressures. His most recent book is Can the Whole World Be Wrong? This one, Little Journalism, Antisemitism, and Global Jihad, published in 2022. So welcome, Professor Landis, and thank you for your time. Looks like you're frozen. There seems to be a problem with the connection. The image is frozen. I don't know if you can hear me. Hello? Oh, seems we have lost the connection. Hopefully, Professor Landis will be able to reconnect soon. Anyway, I will take the opportunity to show once again his book. I mean, his latest book, Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Which is an incredible, well-documented work. Here it is. Looks like it's back. Can you hear me now?
I can. I'm sorry, my computer has been dropping the internet occasionally. I hope it doesn't disturb us too much.
Hopefully not. Anyway, I was just saying thank you for accepting the invitation and for your time. And I already showed your book. So I will start with a question. Can you explain for the audience what the phrase, can the whole world be wrong, that you use as the title of your book means?
Well, before I do that, let me just tell you that the working title while I was writing it was They're So Smart Because We're So Stupid, which was a reflection on the unbelievable stupidity of the West and, you know, the tremendous success of what I call the caliphate or cognitive warfare against the West, which we repeatedly enable. And so, but my daughters told me that I couldn't call it that because I was insulting my readership. And so I went with Can the Whole World Be Wrong? Because in 1897, Echad Ha'am wrote an essay about the pogroms and the blood libel in Ukraine, in which he said, you know, we can take some consolation in the fact that when Jews say we don't eat the blood of Christian babies, the response is, can the whole world be wrong and the Jews be right? And he said, well, you know, at least in this case, yes, the whole world can be wrong and the Jews can be right. And then that was repeated in 2002 after the alleged massacre at Jenin, that in particular the French and British press were eager to report. American press slightly less. I don't follow other presses, so I don't know. But in any case, huge coverage of an alleged massacre that not only didn't take place, but in fact, Israel's casualty ratio was 3 combatants to 1 civilian in urban warfare, which is unheard of and probably will never be matched in the history of urban warfare. And yet the Secretary General of the United Nations at the time, Kofi Annan, when the Israelis said, we haven't done the massacre, his response was, he didn't even ask the question. He said, I don't think that the whole world can be wrong and Israel be right. Again, Israel was right and the whole world was wrong. Now, I have the whole world in quotation marks in the title of the book because it's not really the whole world. What it is it's the public sphere, the journalists, the academics, the talking heads who, for instance, now are all talking about famine in Gaza and about Israel refusing to let aid get in and about the unbelievable amount of suffering that's virtually genocidal, if not actually genocidal. And all of these things are misreadings, which are essentially fed to the West by Hamas and the caliphators. I define the caliphators as Muslims who believe that in this generation we'll see a global caliphate, the establishment of a global caliphate. And the West, via a media which is in some senses addicted to images of Palestinian suffering, is making that possible and creating this massive consensus that the whole world knows how bad Israel is to the poor Palestinians. So that's why I chose that title, because I thought it really got to the point of just how upside down our information systems have become over the last 20, 25 years.
So you would agree that basically the issue we have is a cognitive issue in our society, and it's
Yes.
amazing that it's amazing that the phrase "can the whole world be wrong" is basically the old form of the ancient fallacy of the argumentum ad numerum, and it's reasonable to understand that that would work in Roman times, in Middle Age, but that in the so-called knowledge age, you can use the same structure to bring people to I don't know, med Weltanschauung, you would say in German, med visions of the world. It's
right.
astonishing.
Yes, it is astonishing. And I mean, I remember when, the internet first hit in the 90s and early 2000s. I remember the enthusiasm about this idea that now that there was information abundance and it was free and it was untrammeled, that finally people would be able to judge for themselves what was really happening. And in a sense, the exact opposite happened. People basically self-brainwashed. They literally, and then the algorithms came in to encourage their self-brainwashing. So the only stuff that they get is stuff that reinforces what they already believe. But also, I think, academia played a key role in this, in sort of banning any dissenting voices from what was increasingly a party line, and it was a Palestinian party line, that Israel was the colonial imperialist aggressor, that the Palestinians were fighting for dignity and freedom. And, it couldn't be farther from the truth, and yet that became a kind of consensus. And as you say, you'd expect that wouldn't work, and yet it does. It works remarkably. And even, I have friends who are Jews who are aware of what the problem is and still can't think their way out of this. Still can't. I mean, in a sense, the starting in 2000 with the coverage of what journalists call the Second Intifada, or Al-Aqsa Intifada, what I call the Oslo Jihad. When that started, and the coverage was so skewed, and none of the press were willing to let people know what Palestinians were saying in Arabic, which was genocidal discourse, and a call for war, and instead were sort of projecting their mentality onto them. And when Israelis would say, the Palestinians want this war, their response was, and I quote Jacques Chirac at the beginning of the book, as an illustration of this, he said, you're never going to convince people that the Palestinians want war when they're losing so many people. And yet that's exactly why they want war, because the more people they lose, the more the West sympathizes with them, the more the West demonizes the Israelis, and the more that furthers their strategy and their goals. And we, on the other hand, in the West, don't allow ourselves to realize what kind of an enemy we face.
We are somehow in the Western society, we are prisoners of artificially created paradigms. Looks at what is happening currently in campuses around the United States. Students have no idea what they are doing, what they are protesting, and there is definitely, but the media, when they see protests in U.S. campuses, they made the arbitrary connection with the 60s, the anti-war movement, etc., which has nothing to do with what's going on. We are trapped into paradigms.
Yes, we're trapped in, and the paradigm that we're trapped in is this cognitive egocentrism of projecting liberal attitudes, which are historically extremely rare. But since we grew up and were encouraged to adopt this, it's a good paradigm to adopt as long as it's reciprocal. But we're so committed to believing it that we're afraid to ask for a reciprocal response from the Palestinians, from the triumphalist Muslims, who are following a very medieval agenda, which is world domination. And we don't want to believe that. I mean, I've been accused of racism for talking about the role of honor and shame in Palestinian society. No, you can't say that. You can't say that they want to destroy Israel because they believe that the very existence of an infidel state, a free state of infidels in Dar al-Islam, is a blasphemy and an utter humiliation for the Arab world, and therefore destroying Israel is worth all the lives that it may cost, including lives of Arabs, Muslims, and Palestinians. That in their calculus is a plus. The more Palestinians die in Gaza, the better their campaign works. And we allow ourselves to be manipulated, to allow our compassion to be abused by utterly merciless people. And, as you say on the campuses, you're getting reports and people are saying, oh, well, I finally feel solidarity. And it's like you have a generation that's been raised by, excuse me for saying this, pretty deeply narcissistic parents who don't really have a sense. They grew up, with at best play dates or alone and playing on their screens and stuff. They have no social skills. And all of a sudden they find a community and they're not going to ask about what the ideology is that's driving this community. They're just so relieved to have a cause and a community and a sense of belonging.
Yeah, it's very sectarian. That's why I believe you are in an extremely privileged position to understand this because of your studies on millennialism. So you do know that you have studied for your long career exactly that type of sectarian mentality, end of the world style mentality. So you can make easily the parallels.
Right. And so if you're not going to read me on it, I wrote a book called Heaven on Earth, The Varieties of the Millennial Experience. Then read a book by Eric Hoffer, who was a dock worker in San Francisco in the 1950s. And he wrote a book called The True Believer. And that's it. That's the apocalyptic believer. And one of the things that we know about apocalyptic believers is that the sense of community and purpose and sort of cosmic purpose that they get from joining these groups is so powerful that even when predictions fail, promises collapse, the leadership becomes like the Bolshevik. ferocious, they don't let go. Are you there?
Yes,
Can you hear me?
you dropped. You were breaking up. You dropped for a minute. For a minute. Probably if you
Just
can
for a moment.
repeat what you. Yeah.
Right. So what I was saying was they're so committed and attached to the sense of purpose and community that they have, that even when predictions fail, promises aren't kept, leadership turns into monstrosities like the Bolsheviks did, or the Communist Party Maoists, or the Cambodians with their killing fields and stuff. People are still committed and won't let go of the belief because it gives them so much meaning in their lives.
Yeah.
And there's a historian of these millennial movements named Henri Desroches, a French scholar, who compared a millennial movement that takes, to a forest fire. You
We are having we are. I don't hear you. I don't know if internet seems to be playing crazy right now. I mean, you're frozen again. I don't know if you hear me. Definitely, I'm definitely online. So there is a. Let's wait for. Too bad that internet is doing this. The Professor Landis, the internet dropped. Hopefully, he's going to join us again for this very, very interesting and important conversation, because unfortunately, these are the type of discourses that you cannot find anywhere else, at least not in the mass media, where there is a complete lack of this type of understanding based on scholarship and facts. It's a very sad moment our time is going through. Very sad. But this is what we have been pointing. I mean, it's not difficult to. Here we are. It should be again. Here we are. Can you hear
I
me
am
now?
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes. So the point that I was making when I went out was that you cannot argue facts or even logical arguments with true believers. And we have been so remiss in making the argument before they become true believers that we're really now faced with a terrible situation.
Yeah, if you think that in Russia today there are still people believing in Stalin, for example, or it is
Right.
a really it's an awful cognitive state of our species. I don't know if it's our society, because explanations are various. Actually, here you make another very, very important point based on language used to deceive, and it's the case of Mohammed Atta you made when he accused this lady that didn't want to give him the airplane of racism. Can you please elaborate that?
You have to say that again. I
Yes,
didn't
you made the case of
hear it.
one of. Can you hear me?
What was it that you?
Can you hear now?
Yeah.
Hello. Yes.
Yes.
One of
Yes.
the
I can hear you.
you use for you for example explain, and it's a very important moment when Mohammed Atta, the
Oh,
hijacker of
right.
9/11, accused of
Yeah.
racism that lady that didn't want to give
Right.
him the airplane.
Right. 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 Yes. So actually, since then, I've just run across a wonderful quote from Frank Herbert, who is the author
Dune.
of the Dune series. And in, I think it's Children of Dune, he has one of his characters say, "We will demand freedom from you because that's according to your principles. And when we are weak, we will demand freedom from you because it's according to your principles. When we are strong, we will take freedom away from you because that's according to our principles." And so, you know, the caliphators like Muhammad Atta have been just having a ball accusing us of racism. This is Edward Said as well. Accusing us of racism, telling us we dare not, of Islamophobia. How dare you think that we want to take over the whole world? You're just racist, and we cringe, and we don't want to be racist. And in fact, it's not just Muhammad Atta telling this lady she's a racist, but you know, when he boarded the plane, the security guy thought, "Wow, if I've ever seen somebody who looks like a terrorist, this is the day of September 11th. If I've ever seen somebody who looks like a terrorist, this is it." And yet he didn't dare say anything because he didn't want to be called a racist. So we've had our hands tied by people who are demanding that they be allowed to do what they want according to our principles, and when they feel strong enough. And I think that's what's just happened with 710, or I think in America they say 10/7, October 7th. The response, you know, for the first time, the demonstrations were not demonstrations protesting Israel victimizing the Palestinians. They were demonstrations cheering the victimization of Israel. And instead of the sort of progressive left, the peace camp, the people who at least said that they believed that the Palestinian cause was about dignity and human freedom, instead of them saying, "Oh my gosh, you know, this is a wolf in sheep's clothing, and the mask just slipped," joined in. And so I think that at that point, they really felt that, you know, now is the time where they were strong enough to push even further. And I've read a couple of articles, I hope they're true, in which people are saying they may have overplayed their hand. And they may have overplayed their hand. I mean, I think there are a fair number of people who have awakened to this, but I don't think that there's enough of a sense of just how dangerous it is, you know. So people say, "Okay, I'm not going to support you anymore," but that's not enough. You've got to oppose this stuff.
Yes, actively oppose. But the point is, we are missing terminology. Again, my point is always that we are trapped into paradigms that have been artificially created. You just mentioned Edward Said. I've
Right.
I've I've read Edward Said as much, and you have as well. I do not understand. I mean, the only where is success comes from, because it's a bunch of, to quote our president, a bunch of malarkeys, a bunch of
Yes.
nonsense, a bunch of absurdities, but people just repeat it, you know, and the example is unbelievable in our time. And my point is that the only reason why Said was so successful is because he was at Columbia. That was the only reason. People read Columbia and all their analytical faculties, they are just gone because there is nothing.
Yeah. I don't think I'd agree with that. I mean, it certainly helped that he was at Columbia, but I think that the reception that he got, there's actually, if we're going to use terminology that helps us think about this, Roger Scruton coined the term oikophobia, which is fear and loathing of one's own culture. And I think that what Said was doing was appealing to Western culture and saying, "Look, we don't want to be racists. Racism is bad. And saying nasty things about Arabs is racism. And therefore, you don't want to say anything nasty about Arabs or Muslims." And so, for instance, after Khomeini took over in 79, which was 1400 by their calendar, 79, took over, he wrote a book in which he excoriated Westerners for daring to say that this was a jihad. And in fact, everybody that he accused of Islamophobia was actually telling the truth. And yet, precisely almost because they were telling the truth, they had to be silenced. Now, why he was so successful, there's an Oedipal component. The sort of young and up and coming scholars were able to sort of overthrow their elders and say, oh, you're just a bunch of racist Orientalists, we're going to do it right. I also think that there was a crazy sense of solidarity with the Palestinians, which is one of the most regressive movements on the planet, and yet somehow it's managed to win over people who think they're progressive. So Said, I think, played an absolutely critical role in disorienting us cognitively.
Yeah, also, I mean, let's not forget the amount of money that flows into this type of studies. I mean, in recent months, we have learned a lot about the Qatari grants to all Ivy League universities. I mean, currently at Columbia, there is a Edward Said chair held by another
Yes.
brilliant,
Right.
very brilliant, a person that is not even coherent when he speaks, that he cannot form a full sentence without a lie. That's the Columbia Edward Said professor. So the issue here is deep, and it's what I'm very sad and disappointed that right now in the US and there is a campaign against the Frankfurt School and their brilliant concept of culture industry, because the culture industry, the concept of the apparatus of culture industry would help us a lot to understand how this thought terminating cliche are formed, what you were mentioning. You just need to call somebody a racist and then, or an Islamophobe, and that's it. But is that true or is that not true? That doesn't matter anymore. Truth is, what do they say? The French post-structuralists, they talk about the post-truth, right?
Post-truth.
Yes.
Yeah,
but
no, right. So, for instance, if we were to fight back, one of the things that we'd have to do is tackle Islamophobia, which is, it's a paralytic. The accusation of, in England for over a decade, Muslims were literally turning young British girls, infidel girls, into sex slaves and grooming them as sex slaves. And nobody wanted to say anything because they'd be accused of Islamophobia. Now, that's staggering. And yet we're so afraid of this accusation. It's such a career ender that literally we are paralyzed in defending ourselves. So, absolutely, these words, and now the latest word that's been completely twisted from its original meaning and being used in a cognitive war against us is the accusation that the Israelis are committing genocide. So you have a Palestinian movement, which both in its secular and in its religious forms openly espouses genocide in Arabic, which the media will not report on, accusing Israel of projecting onto Israel their desire to commit genocide. And what you end up with is a public thinking that Israel's trying to commit genocide and defending the Palestinians, whom they believe are just fighting for their freedom. So, to get back to the original title of my book, it's hard to get stupider than that.
Yes, and your book, in this sense, I really hope that would be translated at least in Italian, because it's a galore of information. I'm I mean, I studied the topic as well in the little time I have, but I have to say I've learned so many things, especially two type of things. First of all, what you were just mentioning. I'm not very familiar deeply into the Israeli society, and when you describe, I think the chapter is the pathologies of self-criticism. When you describe that even Israeli historians, Israeli intellectuals are buying not just buying the Palestinian narratives, but are criticizing those who tell the truth, people who are there, that I have to say has been shocking for me.
Yeah.
I knew the work of some pseudo historians. I just wanted to finish. I just knew the work.
It's hard to believe that it has such a grip, even on its really. Yeah.
Yeah. How is that even possible?
Yeah. So look, I mean, as I say, it's the pathology of self-criticism. The Jews as a people are deeply committed to self-criticism, and I would argue that good self-criticism is probably one of the greatest strengths of our people. On the other hand, when it gets pathological, it becomes what I call masochistic omnipotence syndrome, which is a kind of messianic idea that if you just take all the responsibility onto yourself, if it's all our fault, then we can fix it. It's in our hands. And, there was an Israeli that, I finally realized it's not in our hands. We do not, it's not up to us to create to create a peace. It's up to them, and they don't want it. And yet it's so important. It's so, Israelis are, particularly the intellectuals, are so desperate to reach peace that they literally blame themselves for things they're not to blame for, and think that by doing that, they're being magnanimous. Sometimes the best thing to do.
I'm afraid it's again. I can't hear. It's dropping again. That's too bad. I think internet on the side of Professor Landis is not working. Well, let's wait for Professor Landis to connect again, because the conversation is really, the topic is extremely important and extremely interesting. As I was saying, I've been, I mean, the listener of the channel know, I mean, I've been studying this subject for a while, and here we are.
I'm sorry. So I was saying that sometimes, in marriage, sometimes even if you're not wrong, it helps to say I'm wrong and get the ball rolling. But when you're dealing with enemies, when you're dealing with people who will take advantage of every concession you make, then taking more responsibility than you're actually responsible for can be very dangerous. And people get addicted to it. It's like, I quote from Freud in Moses and Monotheism, where he talks about the pleasure that the ego, really he's talking about his ego, the pleasure the ego takes in recognizing its faults and becoming more aware and stuff. Well, that's great if you're doing therapy with the therapist who's on your side. But if you're dealing with a pathological enemy, that kind of self-criticism is just insane.
Yeah, but also, what's extremely interesting here and tragic at the same time is that
right.
you describe I love the way you call it, the Oslo Jihad, and I completely agree, the Al-Aqsa Intifada. And basically,
Right.
it's the same model, the same conceptual model that happened on October 7, because most people don't know that there was a ceasefire with Hamas on October 7. And that was also my question. I was thinking, how is it possible that the Israeli intelligence and army could get so surprised by them? Because they believed that.
Yeah. Yeah. So I actually had some conversations with people in the intelligence community. And again, this gets at sort of the emotional dimension of sort of liberal worldview, which is it's really hard to think of people as really hating you and really wanting to destroy you. So you keep trying to humanize them. And as a result, there's this sort of tendency to believe they couldn't be that bad. And yes, they are. I mean, the astonishing thing about the Oslo Jihad was that it very quickly turned to a suicide terror campaign. It showed no interest in distinguishing between the occupied territories in Israel. It was everywhere. And it was merciless. I mean, not just merciless to Israelis, it was merciless to the kids they brainwashed with hatred and strapped bombs to and sent to shopping malls to blow themselves up. So here you have this merciless movement. And it's precisely at that moment that the liberals and progressives in the West make the Palestinian cause their flagship cause. In 1999, there was a big gathering of sort of the global progressive left to protest, globalization and Western imperialism and so on and so forth. And in Seattle in 1999, the Palestinian presence was almost, I've looked at the publications about it. Nobody mentions the Palestinians. They're not there. And yet once the Oslo Intifada started, it was the flagship. So that in 2001 at Durban, that's the main theme. The Palestinian cause is the main theme of the global progressive left. It's not progressive. It is global. It's suicidal. It violates and betrays every value that progressives allegedly hold. And yet, it's filled with true believers.
But as you say, it's difficult for a Western to understand someone who offers his children as martyrs for
Yes.
whatever reason. So the Western should thinks, okay, there must be something that oppresses them, like I don't know,
Yes.
some crazy dictatorship to force them to that,
Yes.
because we
Yeah.
cannot understand that mentality, and we've been offered only simplifications.
Right. And the irony of it is that on the one hand, we won't allow ourselves to think badly of the Palestinians. We won't allow ourselves to think that Hamas is part of a global jihad that is utterly merciless and will not only doesn't care about Palestinian lives, actively engineers Palestinian deaths so that they can win the cognitive war with the West, which they're doing. So on the one hand, we won't even allow ourselves to think these things. That would be racist. But then we're forced into, not terribly unwillingly, viewing the Israelis as terrible oppressors. So, Paul Berman wrote a book on liberalism and terror in 2003, and he said, look, the liberal looks at it and says to himself, if they're behaving this way, they must be desperate. They must be terribly oppressed. I wouldn't do anything like this unless, and therefore, that's what the Israelis must be doing to them. So the worse the Palestinians get, the worse people thought of Israelis, and the more sympathetic they were to basically a monstrous cause.
Absolutely, a monstrous cause. And the real point here is that all you need to do is to listen to them, because I've heard
Yes.
1,000 times repeating, we are culture, we will win because you value life, we value
Yes.
death.
Yes. Yes.
You just have
Yes.
to listen.
Right. And one of the stunning things is that our legacy media does not use the sites in Israel that translate what the Palestinians are saying in Arabic, and they won't report it. At the beginning of the Intifada, there was a New York Times journalist who was asked to investigate Israeli claims that there was, genocidal hatred in Palestinian media, and that it was like only 7 years before, at this point, what had happened with Radio Mil Colin in Rwanda. And he wrote his article, and he did it, he said, she said, the Israelis say, but the Palestinians say, oh, whatever we say, the Israelis consider it incitement. And the only example he gave was of a speech that was given, a sermon that was given by a Palestinian Authority minister that went something like this: Labor Likud, they're all the same, they're all Jews, kill them wherever you see them, have no mercy on them, destroy them and destroy their enemies like America. And what did he quote from the speech? Labor Likud, they're all Jews, they're all the same, ... close quote. So nobody reading this could imagine what actually was going on. And, so today we're faced with this idea that Israel's committing genocide against people who showed how utterly ruthless, sadistic, vicious they were on October 7th. And all of a sudden, oh, well, it's because of how badly Israel's treated them.
Yeah, but that's also, a proof of the very, very miserable state of our culture, of our understanding, of our cognitive faculties. Because I had this discussion online, of course, with the smart people, commentators, saying, oh, there is a gray zone. And my point was, look, there are many things where you have gray zone. Even killing has gray zones. There is legitimate killing for self-defense, but rape has no gray zone. There is no rationality in the universe, ethical rationality, that can bring you to say it's legitimate to rape. And yet they still scream their nonsensical slogan in campuses. And in some cases they resort to change reality. They say that never happened.
Yep. Yeah, no, so there were, once you're dealing with conspiracy theorists for whom any counter evidence has been planted by the enemy, there's no conversation permissible. But, your point about rape, take it a step further. This wasn't just rape, this was lethal rape. These women were raped to death. This was the most sadistic, vicious form of rape you can imagine. Yet somehow there are people who think of themselves as peace-loving progressives who find this acceptable. And, on some level, I got to think one of the dimensions of this is actually a form of unspoken fear. In other words, people don't want to confront this. They don't want to have to face it. It's easier to deny it and say, oh, well, I'm sure that if X, Y, or Z, they wouldn't behave this way, than to realize that you're facing a merciless enemy. And I mean, this is the kicker of it all, the most imperialist force on the planet. The caliphators are the most vicious, ambitious, imperialist group on the planet, and somehow they have become the defenders of freedom and dignity?
Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. But you
I
see,
mean,
this is the point. They throw, the entire culture industry throws at us complete nonsense coming
yes.
from Hamas, whatever. And we are not able to say, like that old Italian physicist, that it still moves.
Yes, right. Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And I mean, it's a look. I mean, I don't know if you know this, but my father was David Landis, and he wrote a book called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, which was his explanation of why the West had been so successful, why other cultures had been less successful, and so on. And part of his argument had to do with the importance in Europe of nation states independence, so that people could go from one place to another and dissent could always find a place to speak out. One of the reasons that Galileo was nailed by the Inquisition was that while he was in Venice, he was immune to the Inquisition. But when he moved to Florence, because he got to, he got his own studio and full support and didn't have the burdens of citizenship, the Inquisition got to him. But this ability to have different places from which different voices can arise was absolutely in the West. It didn't happen in places like China, where misinformation would go up the chain and literally, the leadership didn't know what was going on in the rest of the country. And we're in that situation now. We're in a situation where the whole world has literally blocked out dissenting voices. And now that you have these people who are totally brainwashed, protesting ludicrous stuff and behaving very badly on campuses, being protected because they need their free speech. So the very people who chased out free speech are now invoking free speech to protect people who are the product of that absence of free speech. I mean, if it weren't so serious, it would be, as one of my friends says, life imitates parody.
Absolutely. But well, in this case, this is the ancient trick in the book. I mean, already in the Iliad, we are warned about that wooden horse, not to let that horse enter the city. And
Yes.
the people who warns us are the wise people, two of the wisest Trojan.
Right. And Laocoon and his sons are strangled, and instead of people saying that's the enemy doing that, they say, oh, that's a sign from the gods, we should take the horse in. And in fact, the Trojan horse is the original cognitive war ploy, which is to get your enemy to allow you to invade.
Absolutely. From Dawa comes Sharia.
Yes.
But again, try to talk. People don't know what Dawa is.
They don't know what that was. I spoke to an audience of 400 Homeland Security officials in the Homeland Security Department. And I started my speech by saying, how many people here know what Dar al-Harb is?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe 20 people raised their hand. And I don't know how many of them did know or just didn't want to look stupid. I mean, but the fact that hundreds of people in Homeland Security don't know what the enemy is thinking about them is staggering.
Staggering. It's insane. Because, I mean, that's know your enemy. And especially in the US budget, where you have billions of dollars invested in intelligence, I mean, this should be priorities number one.
Yeah. Yeah, but the U.S. intelligence and British intelligence and French intelligence have all been deeply damaged by the impact of these fake moderates who insist that we not say anything Islamophobic or that we not insult Muslims. Um, so for instance, Obama and Hillary Clinton and John Kerry, and it goes on today. Basically said, we shouldn't talk about radical Islam because it'll upset Muslims, and radical Islam, jihad is not Muslim. Islam is a religion of peace, but if we talk about it, people who are moderate might end up joining it, which means it's not that far away from what Islam is teaching. It just breathtaking stupidity.
I always say that two of the greatest jokes that people say involuntary are, the first one is the definition of Homo sapiens. That's one of the greatest jokes. And the second one is Islam is a religion of peace. Those are the two greatest jokes that,
yeah,
that you can hear everywhere. But this is someone during a lecture once said that an Islamophobe today is someone who knows too much about Islam.
Yes. I mean, the whole notion of phobia is that it's irrational.
Yes.
If you're not afraid of triumphalist Islam, which is a very powerful force in Islam globally today, if you're not afraid of that, then you're stupid. It's not an irrational fear to be afraid of imperialist, supremacist Islamic actors and thinkers. And yet,
about it and start talking about it, because it's in our tradition. I can go on the street and start criticizing Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism. Nobody's going to be bothered. Nobody's going to say anything. Right. As soon as you start mentioning flying donkeys, speaking trees, and all the splitting moon, then there is a mobster contract over you, like for the poor author of the satanic verses.
Yes, Salman Rushdie.
So we are not defending our own principles. We are not saying if you can criticize, you right. have to be able. There right. is no enlightenment on these topics. Nobody talks about this thing.
Right. I mean, I have this chapter in the book on the Danish cartoon affair. And, the sort of wisdom of the commentators was that nobody won. Well, no, it was a huge victory for the caliphators. They managed to impose Sharia on the West in terms of forbidding the West to engage in what they considered blasphemy. Now, by modern scholarly standards, virtually anything that a scholar has to say about the Bible, New Testament, Quran, you name it, the Hindu sutras and the Buddhists and so on, any text, what scholars have to say is blasphemous in religious terms. But the idea that only Islam can impose its demand that nobody say anything against it is really quite stunning. And so, I mean, I'm writing the sort of sequel to the book on millennialism, which is a study of apocalyptic beliefs in Christianity from the time of Jesus to the peace of God in the 11th century, 33 to 1033. So I have a chapter on the creation, the birth of Islam as an apocalyptic movement. I mean, Muhammad starts by prophesying the imminent last judgment. Now it doesn't come, and the Muslim movement forms around a response to this not coming, in which rather than wait for God to punish the sinners on Judgment Day, they decide they're the ones who have to punish the blasphemers by themselves, and that gives us jihad. So I wrote it and I sent it to somebody who's done very good stuff. And he wrote back and he said he really liked it. I said, do you think I could publish it as a separate chapter? I mean, I didn't hear him laugh out loud, but basically, yeah, nobody's going to publish that.
Another friend of mine actually recently had a contract with a German publisher, and he was telling me that something is changing, because the contract he has is for a book about the two-state solution.
Right.
And in his proposal, he wrote saying, we cannot talk anymore about the two-state solution in the way we have talked until now. And still the publisher accepted the book.
All right.
Something is changing slowly. Probably soon your book will also be
okay.
Hopefully.
Right, but we need. I mean, I don't want to sound any alarms, but we need to change fairly quickly.
Yes.
I mean, it's really, and part of the problem from the beginning. I mean, in my book, I more or less state the year 2000 as sort of a critical turning point. Since 2000, the real problem has been that moderates don't speak out. And that, so you have on the one side the sort of dogmatic revolutionaries who are in league with the caliphators, and on the other hand, you have a larger number of people who know that Islam is not a religion of peace, but they're not going to take on the unpleasant consequences of saying so.
Well, but if I mean, I always say that exposing falsehood is the mitzvah of intellectuals. If you don't do that,
right. No, there's been a failure across the boards in the information professions in the 21st century. The journalists led the way. No, the academics led the way. They were already. Academia was already largely occupied by 2000. The journalists joined in 2000 with their coverage of the Intifada, and as a result, I mean, even librarians, every once in a while I'll run across a tweet from a librarian who's proud to have hidden a book that he doesn't think people should be reading. At one point, I was teaching Sam Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which I think everybody should read and reread. If they haven't read it, read it. And if they have, reread it. And I forgot to bring my copy to school. And so I went to a colleague and I said, can I borrow your copy? And she looked at me and said, I wouldn't have that book on my bookshelf.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's an academic. That's how you think about. That's how your bookshelf is a sort of display of, how politically correct you can be. It's stunning.
It's pure, simple intellectual regression. Because I mean, the fact is that my grandfather used to say, if you can afford only one newspaper, read the one of your enemy, and it's an old proverb, and that's intellectual. That's what an intellectual is supposed to do, and that's why we are in a regressive state, and that's why it is also so dangerous, because we're in a regressive state, but we have nuclear weapons, and those two things don't go well together.
Yeah. It's interesting what you say about read your enemy's newspaper, because right now what we're doing is reading our enemy's newspaper, but we think it's ours.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there is actually one of the viewers is asking a question that I believe it's relevant for our conversation. Is asking, should we be concerned about what is happening regarding pro-Palestinian propaganda?
Absolutely. I mean, you have to understand that Palestinian propaganda is the sort of point of the lance of caliphator propaganda. In other words, the caliphators know still that they can't tell the world that they want to take it over. And they want to turn everybody, either force them to convert to Islam, die, or if they're feeling generous, live as subject people, the dhimmi. So that's not going to sell. But what will sell is the Palestinian cause, which the Russians back in the 60s managed to give this sort of national liberation twist to, so that that can literally invade the Western mind. The Western mind is susceptible to accepting the Palestinian cause. Now, the Palestinian cause, I don't know if you've been following this, but there was big controversy when people were saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. That's not the original chant. That's a westernized chant. The original chant, which is now being taught to demonstrators on campus, is from the water to the water, Palestine will be Arab. It's got nothing to do with freedom. It's got nothing to do with democracy. And when they say Arab, they mean Muslim. So you've got this situation in which people in the West can be sold on the Palestinian cause and adopt it. And in that sense, they're literally doing the bidding of caliphators. And so, Westerners, my colleagues in America, my class list from 1971, they can all write about how, this is not really serious. And, if only Israel were nicer to the Palestinians, I'm sure they'd be nicer to Israel and stuff. They can afford to say it because they don't realize that they're in trouble too. And, I'm not really up on what's going on in Italy, but I can tell you that in places like Belgium and the Netherlands and areas in France and areas in England, you're dealing in Sweden, you're dealing with places that literally have sort of proto-Gazas, proto-Hamas stands.
The entire Europe is, the shocking part is the United States, but the entire Europe is in flame. Recently, during a big, it was thousands and thousands of people in Hamburg, in Germany. They were screaming for the caliphate in Germany, and we do know what's going on in Sweden. The point is that we do know because we follow these things. But if you follow the mainstream media, there is no reporting. In Germany, a 4-year-old baby was stabbed by someone who was. They captured him, and then, of course, because he screamed Akbar, Allah Akbar, then it was is a sign of insanity. So this is my advice for every bank robber: if you wanna just go free, scream Allah Akbar. First say, "Give me your money," then Allah Akbar, and then you're gonna be free.
Yeah.
And the guy was naked, and first of all, it was not reported. Almost, only in Germany, but no other place.
Yes.
And second, nobody explained why he was naked. Nobody. There is no discourse about these things, because the media doesn't want you to understand what's going on in the mind of this deranged or this sick people. And so people are defenseless.
Defenseless.
The majority, yes.
The West is defenseless. When I first understood cognitive warfare, which is essentially when you're too weak to win on the battlefield, you have to convince your enemy not to use his superior strength against you. And when you're dealing with invasive cognitive warfare, you have to convince your enemy to stand down while you invade. And I just would describe that to people. They would say, well, who would be stupid enough to stand down while an enemy invades? And I said, well, that's what's going on right now with Islam. And they'd go, oh, yeah.
Asymmetrical warfare, right?
Asymmetrical warfare.
But you are an historian, and I always find a lot of standing parallels between this historical moment and the late Roman Empire. What do you think?
Yes, I agree entirely. I have a couple of blog posts about that, and some essays. look, what happened during the Roman Empire was the Germanic warriors culture, which was deeply honor shame, feud based warrior culture, um, were invading. And the central government in Constantinople essentially gave in essentially conceded to them repeatedly various areas around the margins, as long as they could continue their existence inside the core. And I think that what's happened and I mean, let's not get into the whole issue of Christianity and the split within the Roman Empire between the sort of pagan patriots and the Christian cosmopolitans who were interested in converting the
Oh, looks like there's a. We can't hear. At least I can't hear. I don't know if any. It's stuck again. Let's wait for so that Professor Landis can reconnect. It's a very interesting development in our conversation, because I mean now it's great to have an historian and especially an historian with the knowledge of Professor Landis to go a little deeper into the historical relationships that should be clear to everybody. Yeah.
So the point I wanted to make is that I think that, you know, in their cognitive war against the West, the Caliphators have been very smart. They've gone after the administration, the administrators of universities, the administrators of the big organizations within the government and so on. And what you've got is a kind of what I call preemptive dhimmi. These are people who are not required to convert to Islam. They just have to observe basic rules about not criticizing Islam and about attacking anybody who does within their community. I mean, historically, the job of the leader of a dhimmi community, whether it was Christian or Jewish, within a Muslim majority state, was to make sure that nobody in their community aroused the anger of the surrounding Muslim population, because at that point the contract was over and they were subject to violence. And I faced with a situation where administrators at universities, the directors of news agencies, and so on, are essentially adopting a position that will sort of grandfather them through this crisis. So they will make concessions. They will allow the invasion. They will, I mean, the Biden administration right now seems literally to be compliant with the demands of Hamas to make sure that it survives. And they will do that all the while maintaining the fiction of their independence and, you know, carrying on about free speech, when in fact what they're doing is just laying the groundwork for submission.
So you think they do understand the difference? Because I'm not sure about that. They do understand what they are doing, because I wouldn't be so sure, you know.
Well, so look, I think that there are some who understand and they know what they're doing, but they won't admit it. They certainly won't admit it to you or to the public. But I think that I'm impressed with, in apocalyptic studies, we talk about cognitive dissonance and the way people are capable of denying things that they just can't deal with. In the apocalyptic world, the failure of prophecy. But in this case, what we're dealing with is they can't deal with their own cowardice. So they adopt the post-colonial paradigm, I'm just defending Palestinian freedom and so on and so forth. And I'm against racism, so I don't want to say anybody to say anything that might upset Muslims. So
I think we lost again the internet. Let's wait for the connection. And it's getting more and more interesting. It's really incredible the amount of scholarship and knowledge that Professor Landis has on the topic. It's something. That's why I always I say, really, at least buy this book, read this book, because it's a mountain of knowledge and information that we are unfortunately missing, and it's extremely well documented with hundreds of notes. It's really a fantastic work. And it is also, I really hope that in Italy some publisher will decide to translate it, because those are fundamental works to understand the historical moment we are going through right now. Fundamental. Let's see if it's coming back. Hopefully yes. Let's see, close this one. Here it is.
Yeah.
Here we are. You're back.
So I'm sorry. So what I was saying was that I think that there are people who literally cannot admit to themselves that they are submitting, and as a result, in order to do their work well, they have to convince themselves that they're free agents who are freely choosing a generous approach that will make things better, even as it makes things worse.
But the point of cognitive dissonance actually is a very central point, because we do know that in some cases innocuous, quote unquote, cults like, I don't know, the Mormons, etc.
Right.
And in other cases with very dangerous situations like Jimmy Jones or David Koresh, right, that leads to death.
Right.
And we do have a similar cognitive dissonance, especially in the moment where you see every country.
Right.
Let's go to the root of the problem. We do not read the core texts of the Islam. That's the problem. Because if you read this text, for example, as a woman or as a queer person, you should feel immediately threatened by what it's written in there. But we don't read that. Now in the US Congress, one representative has been able to give oath on the Quran. This is a bad sign. Yeah. It's a very bad. And again, we misunderstand, because we think freedom of religion, First Amendment, then, yeah, but freedom of religion doesn't mean a text that says women should be submitted to men, should have less rights, homosexuals should be killed. That's not what the First Amendment means.
Right. I think that, I mentioned at the beginning of our conversation about reciprocity. The whole point about the separation of church and state is that you're giving freedom to religions that are willing to give freedom to other religions. So if there's no reciprocity, if you're giving freedom to a religion, like that quote from Frank Herbert, we'll demand freedom from you because that's your principles. But when we're strong, we'll take it away from you because that's our principles. if you can, and I think that really this is where the key, let's call it the key cowardice in the West arises, is people are not willing to demand reciprocity from Muslims. The West should be saying to the Palestinians, and more broadly to their supporters in the Arab world, look, you guys have trouble. You have trouble getting along with your infidel neighbors, as we see in Nigeria and other places. You have trouble getting along with each other, which we see throughout the Muslim world. And in order for you to join the 21st century and be part of a global community that's productive and reasonably peaceful, you need to learn to get along. And, your test is to get along with Israel. Instead of, backing their irredentist demands, which are also aimed at themselves, progressives should be saying to the Palestinians and to the Muslim world, learn to get along with the Israel. They've been, compared to what you do to each other, they've been unbelievably nice. I have a Palestinian friend who says, the Palestinians have the worst friends and the best enemies anybody could hope for.
That's a great quote, yes. But we how should we start when let's talk numbers, for example. How many mosques are in Europe or in the United States, and how many churches are in Saudi Arabia?
Right.
Zero. So that's also reciprocity. Also, I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it was a very famous case in the Italian news for a young boy named Attilio Arrigoni, who went to Gaza to help them because he loved them, etc. Guess what happened to him? I'm quite sure you can guess. He was killed. He was decapitated. And guess what the family did? The family refused with all their strength to have the body go back to Italy, passing through Israel. What is this? This is beyond absurd.
Yeah.
They killed their son.
Yeah. And it's, it's like gays and feminists for Palestine. Our joke in America is turkeys for Thanksgiving.
Yes.
You can't, it's hard to get stupider. And yet there's passion there. There's real passion.
What you just made me think right now, Bonhoeffer, because you say stupid, but Bonhoeffer clearly stated that stupidity is the best allied of evil. And that's a very important point. Let's not also forget Robert Musil. When the Nazis were almost marching into Austria, what he did, he gave a lecture about stupidity. Oh, I think it's gone. What is going on? At the stage. There you are. You back? Hello? It's not working. Anyway, we just had to stay. You're back. Are you? Can't hear. Hello? It looks like internet doesn't want to work with us. This doesn't look good. Too bad, because we were reaching a point that it's quite important.
Hi.
You're back. I don't know how far you heard, but I was saying that stupidity, according to Bonhoeffer, is the best allied of evil. And Musil, when he was talking about the invasion of the Austria by the Nazis, instead of talking about politics, he gave a lecture about stupidity.
I'm sorry, you cut out again. Who are you talking about?
Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the
Yes,
Protestant.
yes. I have a quote from him at the beginning, and
Yes.
it's basically stupidity. You can fight evil, you can't fight stupidity.
Yes. And that's the task. That's why works like yours, this book in particularly, but all the books that have been published, and they are just pointing to facts and truth in a moment of, as Orwell would say, universal deceive, are extremely important. I would actually say fundamental, not just for our culture, but also for the survival of a world, unless we just want to renounce those principles that have built the Western tradition, as we are doing, unfortunately, thanks to the complicity of the culture industry. We are just giving up what's most precious in our society, in the world, because we have also to consider the amount of good that the Western tradition brought to us. And when we forget, that's why it's important to have historians start talking. Yeah, you're back. Seems that internet doesn't works against us today.
Terrible. I got to take this in and get it fixed.
Anyway, we have talked for a bit, so I want just to ask you one last question. And yeah, there are so many, but you, in your book and other writings, you have also dealt with political correctness and other related ideological movements. What have recent events on American campuses added to what you already knew?
Well, I would say the reaction to October 7th has been enormously discouraging for me, because for the last 20 years I've been writing about this and waiting for the moment when people wake up. I was just recently at an new exhibit here in Israel, and they had it was about World War II, and they had a timeline. September 1st, 1939, invades Poland. September 3rd, 1939, France and England declare war against Germany. So, the invasion of Poland woke up the Europeans, the democratic Europeans, who had been hoping that it was peace in our time, and so on. I would have hoped that 710 would do something like that, but the power of political correctness has been so immense, so insistent, that what the behavior of Hamas on 710 should have triggered, and it did to some extent. There were articles by people who normally didn't talk about this, about Hamas's genocidal charter and about the genocidal preaching of its imams and so on and so forth. But it didn't take the power of political correctness, of not saying things that are Islamophobic, of having immense compassion for Palestinians, so that every Palestinian life lost is just unbearable, whereas hundreds of thousands of lives are being lost, and Uyghurs are in concentration camps, and you've got suffering all over the world, but somehow only Palestinian suffering is what rouses the compassion of the West. The forces driving it in 2000, political correctness is not a bad thing per se. There are certain things that probably we shouldn't be using. I mean, I use Common Era instead of Anno Domini. You could argue that's politically correct, or to say the Hebrew Bible rather than the Old Testament, that these are ways of correcting built-in biases of language that had been generated by one point of view, and a larger point of view would say, no, let's not use that language. So there's, in principle, political correctness is not wrong. What happened in 2000, all the politically correct things about how the Palestinians are ready for a state, if only Israel gave more, there would be peace, and so on, not only weren't dropped because they were inaccurate, shown to be inaccurate, but they almost became dogma. So that, during the Oslo peace process, everybody was saying to the Israelis, well, no, you really need to trust the Palestinians and Arafat will deliver, and so on and so forth. The whole thing was based on telling the Israelis to be trusting. And then after 2000, it became not even telling, demanding that the Israelis trust people who had shown themselves to be untrustworthy. So, once it becomes a kind of ideological dogma, political correctness can become really poisonous, and that's what's happening.
Yeah, we are to the point where quoting Martin Luther King is considered racist. So
yeah, no, I mean, look, I wrote an essay which I still haven't found a place to publish, called "Today My Father Would Be a Heretic." If you say that the West is, remarkable for what it's done, then you're a racist. I went into medieval history to try and understand at what point the West set out on its peculiar path. By the time I came up with an answer, it was no longer legitimate to ask the question why the West was different, because that's an invidious comparison. And it makes other people look and feel bad. So we don't say it. We don't talk about it. And yet it's just the things that made the West productive and free to a remarkable extent, that are being literally denied and suppressed by woke ideology today. So merit is privilege. It's not merit. I mean, the whole basis of equality in the West, which is the only place where equality has been pursued as a political goal, the basis of equality is equality of opportunity, and you reward merit according to who's meritorious and not according to who your uncle is or your connections are or your religion is. And yet now we're literally having that tossed out the window in favor of, I mean, the way, the joke I put it is, pre-modern justice is my side is right even when it's wrong. Modern justice is whoever's right, my side or not. And postmodern justice is their side, whether they're right or wrong, we got to take their side.
it's a modern version, globalized, of what in the past used to be defined as the jüdische Selbsthass, the Jewish own hate. Now it's globalized to the entire West. The West hates itself, or at least a fringe part. We don't have to forget how vulnerable are democracies to organized minorities. The Bolsheviks, the Nazis, the fascists, they were all organized minorities.
Right.
And that's a problem we don't want to face, because we believe to live in the best, like Pangloss,
Right.
the
Best
of all
possible
worlds.
Right.
Anyway, Professor Landis, I have to thank you very much for this conversation. I've enjoyed that enormously, and hopefully we will be able to repeat this in the future.
All right. Hopefully my computer will behave better at that time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.